Hello everyone! Welcome back to Poly 301. Today I've got a brief video for you in which we'll be discussing how to select cases to perform a confirmatory case analysis. When I drop the rubric for Composition 7, you're going to be seeing that the last step in the research process that we're going to be considering is a sort of case study in which we'll be taking two observations from the broader data set that you've been investigating and performing some kind of qualitative investigation to try to make sure that the causal mechanism that you've described in your theory holds up under scrutiny. Now, I will mention that if you are doing this with individuals, if this is some kind of data set in which you've got individual people, like your survey respondents, as your outcome, or as your population, then we don't need to worry about this as much, this step, because instead we're going to be essentially selecting two individuals that we know to interview in order to help confirm these linkages. More on that in a little while. But again, if you're not dealing with individuals who are sort of survey respondents in a population, instead, we're going to be doing something like this to help determine exactly which cases we should zoom in on, which cases to scrutinize. So I really have just a very basic little do file here for you that helps you with this task. The first thing that I'll say is it's important to remember that you've got tidyverse run and installed here. So if you don't have it installed, of course, by now you probably run into some significant problems. But of course, I'm going to run this thing to make sure that it's attached. We'll see one thing is very interesting, dplyr filter, right? This conflict mask stats filter. That's actually going to be very important in a moment because we're actually going to be using that filter command to help us figure out which cases to select for qualitative analysis. We also are going to be introducing another little package called ggRepel. We'll see how this works in a second. This is, of course, also not necessary for your investigation, but it's something I like to run just as a very quick and easy way to augment a scatter plot to show some relationships in even better detail. So essentially, the whole goal of what we're doing here in Module 6 is we're hunting for cases that will allow us to help sort of see the relationship that we're trying to study. So I've talked already about this idea of confirmatory cases. There is the possibility that you might want to investigate outlier cases as well. That is, cases that are just far off of this sort of diagonal axis that I'll be talking about in a second. Cases that just don't fit necessarily with the pattern that you're seeing in your data. But first, of course, we need to see the pattern in the first place to understand whether or not we've got some confirmatory cases out there or we've got some outlier cases out there. So what I've done here is I've augmented a bivariate scatter plot with labels, essentially. I've used a command here at the end of this stack of commands called geom_text_repel. What this essentially does is it says add labels that repel each other, so that sort of fill the space and don't overlap, so we can read them, to each point in a geom point scatter plot. So of course, we've already seen this data. We're working again with the tapless data. And again, we're considering the research question essentially, does alcohol by volume have an influence on the price of beer? So I'm going to go ahead and run this command, and we will see, hopefully, in just a second, a beautiful scatter plot appear. And in fact, we do see that. This is really nice to see. I can even make it bigger by sort of stretching the plot frame here in RStudio very nicely. And what we ultimately see here is all of the names of the beers next to their respective points on the scatter plot. Isn't this a cool plot? I love a plot like this. And you'll see that the way that I did this was simply to say that the geom is point, and I've included this thing called label equals name. So remember, when you're going in here and you're filling in your own variables, whatever that ID variable is in the data set, whatever that's called, that's what becomes this label. So mine is called name, yours might be called ID, or state, nation, or country, or whatever it is, right? It's usually that leftmost column in your data. And that's what's gone into this label specification. So in the XY ABV versus price relationship, now all of a sudden, thanks to this command and this command, I now have all of these names. And so what I really like about a graphic like this, and of course this isn't a necessity, but it's a very helpful thing, don't you think, is to look at this relationship and start to think about where there are potential sort of points in this cloud, basically, that would be especially interesting from a qualitative perspective to go in and investigate more thoroughly. So for example, I might be interested in this retribution, whatever this retribution is. It's really, really, really high alcohol by volume. It's really, really, really expensive. And so I might want to find more out about that beer. What is it particularly that makes it so expensive? Is it because it's so boozy? Is it because of some other factor, right? Maybe this is going to allow me to uncover a potential source of spuriousness that I would have never investigated previously. Also, maybe I want to come down here and look at some things on the bottom end of this relationship. What about this National Bohemian beer that some of you may have heard of, right? What is it about this beer that makes it so low in ABV and so low in price, right? Is there something else about this beer also that might be causing it to sort of fall on this, sort of at the bottom end of this diagonal? We also might see a few beers that are sort of on the outskirts of the overall pattern. So of course, this is a data set that is fairly well behaved, but this beer, Salt and Sea, this is a beer that's a very low ABV, but it's a relatively high price. That's interesting. Beers like in this quadrant over here, these are beers that are a little bit off of the diagonal, we might say. So the Blood Orange, something, Sea Quench, right? Some of these beers up here, these seems to be a little bit off the diagonal. Then we've also got this Conway's Irish Ale, which is a little cheaper and a little bit boozier than we might otherwise expect if we were to sort of draw a line through these points. And so part of this this goal, right, is to try to select either these outlier cases that are falling way outside of the pattern, right, that are interesting to examine, or those confirmatory cases which seem to line up really well with expectations. So whichever it is that you choose, ultimately this kind of a graphic might be helpful. The other way to help determine these cases is to, once you know sort of the contours of your data, using table, for example. Oh my goodness, I cannot. That's very strange. There we go. Tap list. Let's see. ABV. Once you've created a table like this and you're able to see the sort of range of your data here, right? We go from 4 all the way to 11. We know the price as well. Ranges from about $3.50 to $8.50 in this variable. We might be able to start thinking about what about cases at the high and at the low and low, respectively, levels here. So for example, we can use the filter command to select among the beers in tap list rows for which the following conditions are true. And so you can put in your variables here, and you can put in greater thans or lesser thans to help specify specific sort of areas of the data. This is basically like taking a slice out of a crosstab. Here we're saying, show me, RStudio, please show me beers in tap list, the whole record, for which the alcohol by volume is greater than 8% and the price is also greater than $8. And if we of course run that, we'll be able to see this is basically that one slice out of this data set. And we'll see that there's, as we can see here, right, only one beer for which that's the case, this Retribution Stout. So this is very helpful because that now I'm able to see all the characteristics of it. We know exactly what the case is, and now I'll be able to go and do my qualitative investigation on the Retribution Stout and read more about what it is and why the heck it's so darn expensive. We might also be able to run filter on these confirmatory cases that are low at the bottom, right? Alcohol by volume being less than 5 and price being less than $5. And of course we see again this cluster down here that we already know about, right? Bud Light, Miller Lite, National Bohemian. I'd be able to take these beers and say, okay, what's going on, at the bottom of this list, for example, in my confirmatory analysis. And you could also do things where you look at, for example, let's see, things where the alcohol by volume is very high, or maybe greater than 7%, and yet the price is low, right? Price less than, you can do less than or equal to. Oh, I think my keyboard is set in French. This is, I think, the problem. But anyway, you'd be able to run this, and you'll be able to see these different beers. And so now the question that we are left with, the question that is the most meaningful is, once we've identified some of these beers that are at the sort of bottom or top end of our distribution or just weird for whatever reason, we want to do some sort of investigation of what they are like, what they're all about. And so this is what we want to do, right? We want to actually find out about these beers. So one that we might be able to ask about is this Retribution, right? What's this beer, Retribution Stout from Duclaw? Okay, here we go. So I'll search for it. I'll look. Okay, here's Beer Advocate, Untapped, all these sort of beer list sites. Beer Advocate. Okay, so one thing that I'm immediately finding out about this by investigating this one case, first of all, is that the alcohol by volume is, as it says in my data, 11.5%. It's very high. It's a bourbon barrel aged. So that's one thing, is that it's been aged in a bourbon barrel. It's maybe one of the reasons why it might be expensive beyond it being boozy, right? And we also see something, this has got a score of outstanding. This is something that we don't have in our data, which is that this beer has been rated by, I guess, beer nerds, to be a delicious, incredibly tasty beer, except for this person who's given it a 3.2 or something. All right, so we can read some reviews about this beer. And again, I'm not bringing this up so that I can tell you about Retribution beer. This is not the point of the exercise, right? I bring this up so that we can ask the same question about your data, right? How would you be able to go ahead and find relevant information, the granular, qualitative information about this stuff that helps you to put this all together, right? So here we've got Wikipedias and stuff, beer menus. I guess here's a website that rates beers. Here's one other thing that we're seeing here, right? This one is rated on Untapped as a 2.95 out of 5. So it's much less highly rated, for example, than this other beer. Again, I'm discovering some detail that was not contained in my data set about this beer as well. And so when we're going in here and we're trying to do this kind of either outlier case exploration, why is this case bucking the trend so much? Why is it so far away from the overall sort of positive relationship here? Or the confirmatory cases, why do these cases help to confirm and to represent my theory, right, about price and alcohol by volume? How does this help to bolster my overall claim, right? Selecting those two cases, again, in every composition 7, you'll be selecting at least 2 cases to perform this kind of analysis, right? These tools that I've given you just really make that a lot easier. So the actual hard part is going to be this, right? Doing the actual research, the qualitative research on your cases, becoming experts of the cases. Using Google Scholar, right, to understand better the properties of that one case. That's going to be your goal in this analysis. But at least with RStudio, as we move away from the quantitative world into the qualitative world, we are given another tool that allows us to be much more selective, much pickier in terms of which beers we choose to help to bolster that relationship. So with that, I leave you to think about those cases, think about the case selection, how that's going to look for you in your project, and then ultimately how your qualitative data analysis is going to actually happen, be it through some sort of archival historical research, through the review of the secondary source information, or even through interviews with people that would have potentially been in your survey data set had they been interviewed at the time. So I leave you to it. Good luck, and certainly let me know if you have any questions. So long.